Intro. What's going on? Let me tell you an anecdote, but not about me, about you. Once upon a time, you started reading a story, and before you realized what had happened, you were hooked. You were dying to know what would happen next, to the point that you were almost physically unable to put the book down. Then another thing happened. You noticed that you were having a great time. Maybe you were laughing your ass off, or maybe you were amazed by the beauty of the descriptions and the scenery, or maybe you were thrilled by some element of the action or the world building. You were sitting there following this long string of letters, and it inspired in you all of these positive emotions. And then a third thing happened. You finished reading the story, and you were in a haze. You were sad that it's over, of course, but more than that, you had this feeling like you have been changed, like something has happened to you during the reading. Sometime later, having digested the experience, you decided that you would like to write a story yourself. You felt like you had a pretty good concept of what it was that made the story work. Maybe it was an element of the world building, or some emotions that the characters were going through, or maybe the voice that the writer used in order to communicate things to you. So you tried writing a piece yourself, capitalizing on that understanding. Then you let people read it, or more likely you read it yourself sometime later and realized that the thing you wrote was not it, that the concept of writing that you had was not it. Sobered, humbled, and slightly humiliated, you set out to consult the experts, people who have succeeded in the task of writing great works. You learned about structures and what voice to use and conflict, and what the hell are you supposed to do with a protagonist? And then you set out to write another story. But again, the final product wasn't as impressive as you wanted it to be. There are two questions that I'd like to answer in this video. One, what happens to you when you read a great story? And two, how can you create the same experience in another person? I'm going to answer both of these using stories, starting with the anecdote that I started the essay with. As you were reading that story that we talked about, three things happened to you. One, the story evoked interest, which made you curious about what's going to happen next. Two, the story evoked beauty, which made for a positive experience. And three, the characters' emotional trajectories moved you, which evoked meaning. That answers the first question. What happens when you read a great story? The story evokes interest, beauty, and meaning. We're going to define these terms and look at some examples, but for now suffice it to say that if a story doesn't have interest, you won't continue to read it. If it doesn't have beauty, you won't enjoy it. And if it doesn't have meaning, you won't remember it. Now, for the second question, how do you create a story that affects other people the same way? Easy. You just make sure that your story has interest, beauty, and meaning. Easy peasy, right? Well, not exactly. We now have to answer the three questions of how do we evoke each one of these elements. In the pursuit of knowledge, for every answer that you get at least as many questions. By the end of this video, you'll probably have more questions than you do now. But that's fine. Those questions will be smaller, more specific, and more manageable. Instead of one huge, terrifying question like, how do I write a great story? You're going to have a pretty reasonable question like, how do I resolve this specific conflict in the most meaningful way? And if we both do our jobs correctly, by the time we're done here, you will have the tools to figure out which question to ask at every step of the way as you write the story you want to tell. And when I say both of us need to work, I mean that literally. As you listen to this, be active, because what I'm telling you is a model, and models are always wrong. Human beings don't get to glimpse pure truth. It is what it is. But that's not a bad thing. Models are what we use to create flying machines and the web of information that you are using right now to listen to my voice. There will be differences between this model and the truth, and I would like you to find them. And even if you don't find outright mistakes, I think there is value in listening actively, in being critical. This is how I developed this model, by listening to other people's ideas about writing and getting this feeling like something is missing. A unifying principle. I think that's enough introduction for now, and we can finally begin. That is, assuming that I've piqued your interest. I'm going to talk a lot in this series about how it's better to come up with conclusions yourself rather than passively be told. Following that logic, I'd like to ask you a question. Why are you still watching this? This video is mostly about fiction, not only partly applicable to essays, but as much as it is, I'd like to use this very essay that you're watching right now as an example to the point I'm trying to make. What has this video done so far to promise to you that it's better to keep watching than click on any of the thumbnails on the side? First of all, it poses a lot of questions and promises to answer them. First and foremost, the question of how do I become a good writer, a question I assume you would really like a good answer for. You know what question I'm going to answer, but you don't know how I'm going to answer it. This is really similar to what you have in a good story. Any good story. Whodunit is a genre named after the question it promises to answer, but it also promises that the answer will surprise you. The first time you saw a heist movie, you may have been surprised when things went sour, but now when you watch a heist plot, you know something has to go wrong and the protagonist will find a way to fix it. You just don't know what and how. Lord of the Rings promises that the boys will destroy the ring, but you don't know how, and there is a big question of how much of himself Frodo will lose on the way there. The questions can be implied, like will they fall in love, or will the protagonist beat the villain, or they can be spoken out by the characters, like and will we ever end up together? Or what is the Matrix? Putting your protagonist in conflict is simply another type of question. How will the protagonist resolve this? Or depending on the genre, will the protagonist win? Questions and promises are going to be interchangeable in this segment. We could say that a conflict is in fact a promise for a resolution. Worm, my favorite book ever, starts with a relatively unclear promise, which might be the reason why a lot of readers stop reading on the first couple of chapters, but quickly makes such compelling promises that readers describe the experience of reading it as holding on to a live wire. That is, they can't really stop, they can't let go, even when they feel like they should. These promises or questions create interest, which is the main force driving the reader to keep reading. The expectation of what it is that they're going to receive. Interest is not the most important function of a story, but I do think it's your first priority to get good at creating interest. Why? Because you need feedback in order to improve, and you need people to read your stuff in order to get their feedback. Even if you pay somebody to critique your work or make some sort of barter, it is better for you if people are engaged. You will get better critique if they are engaged. But engagement isn't quite the same as interest. If we define engagement as the likelihood of a person to keep reading, we have on the one hand the force that keeps them reading, that pushes them to continue, which is the interest. And on the other hand, we have the effort that is demanded of them to read. Whether you're reading horror or poetry, you keep applying effort because you expect to get something out of it. If you're still watching this essay, that means that I've managed to create more interest, that I've demanded effort. And it is about effort, not about time. Specifically, about how much conscious effort the reader is demanded to apply in order to understand what's going on. The more interested they are in what's going on, the more effort you can demand of them. On the other hand, if you demand too much effort or not provide enough interest, the reader simply stops reading. So this is our first overly simplified formula. Engagement equals interest minus effort. Simplistic as it is, I've used this formula to construct every single sentence that you've heard me say so far, thinking about maximizing engagement. So how do we do that? Let's start with the easier part of the equation, the effort. How do we make sure that the reader applies the minimum amount of effort? Quoting Strunk's Elements of Style, eliminate unnecessary words, eliminate unnecessary words, eliminate unnecessary words. Why is Strunk repeating this message while preaching the importance of avoiding redundancy? Well, first of all, because it's funny, making it memorable, but also because it is really important to understand. When people ask me, when did you start writing? I have 3 different answers, and they're all true. One of them is that my writing began the moment I paid a professional editor to critique my work. And one of the first things that I remember her doing is deleting an entire paragraph and replacing it with a single adjective in the prior paragraph. At first I was furious, then I was skeptical, but in the end I was grateful because she taught me something valuable. and that is that we must make our writing as short as possible without losing anything important. So eliminating words is good, but what's even better is making sure that the writing is flowing to read, that it has a pleasant rhythm. I will not get into how to do this in this video, but I will recommend the text that helped me a lot in understanding this skill. Gary Provost's "This sentence has 5 words" that I'm showing on the screen right now. It will take you less than a minute to read, preferably out loud, and it might change your writing forever. It sure changed mine. Flow is a skill, and a skill that is relatively easy to learn, especially when you compare it to creating interest. In David Mamet's masterclass, Danger Dave recommends to make it interesting, which at first I thought was the worst writing advice I ever heard, until I realized it's the best writing advice I ever heard. Why? Because there is no formula to make something interesting. If there was a formula, it would be predictable and therefore not interesting. Let me explain once more by telling a story, and this is a story about 3 engineers that are tasked with inventing a flying machine. The first one looks at a bird and figures it out instantly. In order to fly, you need 2 wings and forward movement, so she builds an airplane. It flies. The second engineer comes up with a slightly more complicated design, a helicopter, and he shows it to the first engineer, who is now the authority on flying machines. The first engineer reluctantly agrees that it might work, because a helicopter's blade is a wing moving forward, sort of, and so they join forces to build a new genre of flying machines. It also flies. The third engineer comes up with a completely different design, a hot air balloon. The first 2 engineers laugh their asses off when she shows them her blueprints, but you can bet your donkey they both feel kinda stupid when it rises into the air. The true formula for a flying machine has nothing to do with wings or hot air. It is simply that the machine needs to generate enough upward force to overcome gravity's pull. Writing is the same. Make sure your story generates more interest than it demands effort, or your story will crash. So how do we create interest? We just keep making promises, we keep asking questions. Sometimes I think all that a plot is a series of promises made and fulfilled. And pacing is just the frequency in which new promises arise. A lively plot has a lot of questions and a lot of answers, and hopefully one big promise at the beginning that pays off in the end. I want to talk a little bit more about big and small promises. In episodic TV shows, every episode starts with a new question and ends with an answer. This is usually comedic or light watching. In shows that carry season-long arcs or pre-planned arcs that span a couple of seasons, you might come across heavier episodes, but you're more likely to be propelled into a full-fledged binge. The combination of both should be done carefully. The weebs in the crowd know about filler episodes, episodes that break away from the main plot, make a small promise, fulfill it quickly, and then come back in order to buy time for the creators. Nobody likes filler episodes. But this could also happen in books. Sometimes in the middle of a book, an author will realize that they haven't created enough tension, and so they will make new promises. But if these promises don't seem to add to the central fulfillment that the reader is looking for, the reader won't be as engaged. I really don't want this to sound like I'm telling you the only way that this should work. There are many ways to do this. There are many types of promises. Starting your novel with a beautiful line promises that the novel will be well written. Starting on a specific theme promises an exploration of that theme. I'm not going to tell you what kind of promises to make, but I do recommend developing an intuition for it. And how do we develop an intuition? Again, many ways, but what worked for me is writing the first page of a fictional book and letting someone read it. Then you can ask your reader if they got bored, and if so, when, and then try to understand why at that specific spot. I remember vividly the first time I gave a friend a piece of my writing, and they asked me when can they read the rest, and then I knew that I got them. If you do this enough times, you'll get a feel for how engaging your writing is as soon as you're done writing it. If you only take one thing away from this series, is that developing an intuition is the goal of training to write. Intuition is what makes a good writer. Not only is intuition more important than any specific piece of advice, I advise you to feed your intuition with specific pieces of advice. If you read somewhere that dialogue has to have conflict in order to be interesting, try it out. Write a dialogue that has conflict. See what makes it work. But also see if you can think of a dialogue that you've read that didn't have conflict and was still interesting. I can think of a couple of examples. But whatever example you find, see if you can write one yourself. See what makes it work or not work. Play with it, try things out. In a similar vein, I believe that coming up with theories yourself is significantly more valuable than passively ingesting writing advice. So let's practice together on an example, the opening passage of Cormac McCarthy's The Road. As we read, try to understand what it is that makes this passage so interesting. When he woke in the woods in the dark and the cold of the night, he'd reach out to touch the child sleeping beside him. Nights dark beyond darkness and the days more gray each one than what had gone before. Like the onset of some cold glaucoma dimming away the world. His hand rose and fell softly with each precious breath. He pushed away the plastic tarpaulin and raised himself in the stinking robes and blankets and looked toward the east for any light, but there was none. I fucking love this shit. Cormac fucking McCarthy, ladies and gentlemen. Aside from the delightful prose, can you list all of the questions that naturally arose in you during the reading? What theme was promised? What were you told about the characters? How do you think this story will end? If you didn't find this passage particularly engaging, I recommend doing the same with your favorite story. In fact, I would recommend it regardless. Let's make a smooth segue into the next subject. Interest and engagement are important. They keep your reader reading. And you can't take your reader through a life-changing experience if they drop your book on the first chapter. Be aware of what it is that you're promising the reader, of how much it is that you're promising your reader, and also be aware of the effort that you are demanding. Sometimes you need to demand more effort in order to pull off something specific that you really want. And that's fine. But like a pilot going in for a barrel roll, you need to make sure that you have enough altitude to pull it off. Am I proud of that metaphor? Yes, I am proud of that metaphor. Thank you for asking. But engagement isn't everything. If you've read Boris Akunin or renowned author Dan Brown, you know that sometimes you can pick up a book and be so engaged that you can't put it down until it's finished. But once it's finished, you realize that nothing really stayed with you. You're left with this emptiness. In order to achieve our goal of creating this amazing reading experience within the reader, we need to understand how to create beauty. I don't know what beauty is, but I know some things about it. I know that it is a feeling. It arises in you when you see some sights or hear some sounds or be exposed to some new concepts. I know that it is a good feeling and that it is a satisfying one, unlike, for instance, excitement, which is a positive feeling, sure, but it's one that is suspenseful. I think that beauty has to do with stimuli that fit a pattern. It can be a melody that fits into some harmonic rules, or it can be a face that fits into some aesthetic rules that are hardwired into your visual cortex or something. It can be a concept that is new and interesting and fits into a pattern that you didn't know that you already had in your mind. If you're like me, you may have had the privilege of sitting down in a scientific course about fluid dynamics or bacterial evolution and feel absolutely blown away by the beauty of the concepts. In a well-written scientific course, every concept that is introduced is new and surprising, while at the same time fitting into your prior understanding of the subject. I'm pretty sure beauty has something to do with something clicking into place, mentally speaking. In writing, beauty is going to be a very fuzzy subject. It's going to bleed out into plot, and it definitely has something to do with creating something meaningful. But I want to talk about the part of writing that is beautiful without having to do with interest or human emotions. The word aesthetic might be better, but I feel like it's too small. The thing I want to talk about is so much bigger than just visuals. Something like the feeling of the vastness of space that you get when you read space operas, or the excitement and majesty when an author describes to you what it feels like to ride a dragon, or the brutal thrill of two people trying to kill each other. The aesthetic doesn't have much to do with the kind of emotional trajectory the characters go through. Even within my favorite genre, assassins playing hide and seek with guns, you can write a story where the main emotion is revenge, like John Wick, a story where the main emotion is fear and indifference, like No Country for Old Men, Or a story where the assassins love each other, like Taiyo Matsumoto's Number 5, which I really recommend. It's weird and just so unique. Just like you can write completely different stories with the same aesthetic, you can write the exact same story with different aesthetics. For example, The Count of Monte Cristo and The Stars My Destination tell very similar stories, but one of them takes place in space. I'm not telling you which one. The aesthetic in itself can have a dimension of question and answer. Good world building will give the reader an opportunity to ask questions about the world and have those questions answered in beautiful ways. I mean it when I say that fights are a sort of an aesthetic, and I'd like to expand on that with an example. It is not the best fight scene ever, but I do think it's a good one for making my point. It is from the book Worm that you may have heard me talk about 1,000 times, and it goes something like this. The supervillainous Taylor has the power to control all of the bugs in her vicinity, as well as know their exact location. The assassin Oni Lee has the power to teleport, kind of, an ability that he uses in a very pragmatic manner. He teleports behind people and then stabs them. As the fight begins, Oni Lee teleports behind Taylor and she just barely avoids getting stabbed before he disappears again. It is clear to the reader what's going on. If he can keep doing this, Taylor will eventually get stabbed. What Taylor does is direct her bugs to land on Oni Lee, and so the next time that he disappears, she feels them disappearing and then appearing suddenly right behind her. The reader instantly knows what's going on. And so they're not surprised as Taylor turns around and smacks the surprised Oni Lee right in his stupid face. The fact that what every action in this fight means is instantly clear to the reader is not just important. I now consider this essential, even though a lot of famous authors don't. A lot of authors are okay with just describing the protagonist and the villain slugging at one another. But the way I think about it, if I want something to click into place, I need to make it very clear to the reader what it is that is clicking into place. Notice that when I described the fight scene in Worm, you could appreciate the beauty of it, even though you didn't know how it communicates with any of the other layers. In Worm itself, of course, the scene is deeply connected to Taylor's emotional development, her connection to her teammates, and the overarching plot. If it didn't, I probably wouldn't remember it. Beauty, I think, is the least important layer. In a book about supervillains, there will be a lot of scenes about superheroes fighting, but most of the scenes won't be about superheroes fighting, and they will still be interesting because they will propel the plot forward and they will have emotional significance. I said before that I have 3 different answers to the question, when did you start writing? The second one is when I was 12. I wrote a short story that was Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy knockoff. It had the impossible aesthetic as well as an attempt at dry humor, but no plot or meaning. Even if I had managed to write like Doug, which I assure you I didn't, a story that relies on beauty alone simply can't work. Is what I just said true? Broadly, the only book that I can think of that relies almost solely on beauty is Blood Meridian. Blood Meridian cheats in the sense that it has 2 layers of beauty, one in the things being described and another in the way that they are described. I'm not telling you not to write a Blood Meridian, I'm just asking you to consider what it is that you are demanding of the reader when you write such a novel. When working with beginner authors on their first book, there will always be that one scene that is pure beauty. In a martial arts novel, that's going to be a fight that doesn't have any stakes. In a smut novel, that's going to be a hand-holding scene between a couple that has already been established. In a science fiction novel, that's going to be some long-ass description of imaginary technology. And when I tell the author that I was kind of bored while reading that scene, they always tell me the same thing. You don't understand. It's because you're not into ninja fighting, or girls holding hands, or imaginary space engines. I read this stuff all the time, and I find it fascinating. And I always tell them the same thing. I ask them to find one good scene that they have read that had just a beauty element without any stakes or emotional development. And sometimes they come back and say that actually I was right and every scene that they love did have some function in the other layers. Sometimes they come back with a description of a space engine that they just loved, and I can't really argue with that. If they love it, they love it. You can write that kind of scene if you want, but I do think that if you are cognizant of how much the scene communicates with the other layers, you will be able to write better stories, whatever your metric for a better story is. I said that beauty bleeds into the other layers, and I'd like to expand on that. In plot, it's easy to say that if interest is about the questions, beauty is about the answers. One of my favorite examples for beauty in plot is Oedipus Rex. Oedipus's father hears a prophecy that his own son will kill him, which is very interesting. You immediately ask, how is this going to be resolved? The father exiles the child, which leads to Oedipus growing up not knowing the man and killing him in a fit of road rage, which would not have happened had the father not exiled the son. It clicks into place, doesn't it? It makes sense in an unexpected way. Again, it is always better to arrive at conclusions yourself instead of being told. So think back on the endings that you enjoy, that you remember as exceptional. Do they comply with the rule that I'm stating here? And as I'm stating a rule, make your resolutions make sense in an unexpected way, you might feel compelled to now comply with this rule. This is a really good time to talk about information poisoning, knowledge poisoning, that thing that happens when you have so many rules that you can't write, that the demands that you place on yourself are so high, while your ability to create is relatively underdeveloped, that writing becomes impossible. How do we avoid that? Within you, there are two wolves. One of them comes up with ideas, and the other one critiques those ideas and points out why they won't work. You need both of these wolves in order to create something good, but they have to work together. Some writers are not critical enough. The question they have in their head is typically, what do I feel like writing? The writing is strange and surprising, which I like, but at the same time, it doesn't really engender an enjoyable reading experience. The challenge for that kind of writer is to become less creative and more critical. On the other hand, there is a writer whose main question, the main thought guiding them is this okay? The writing of those kind of writers often feels domesticated. The challenge for those kind of writers is to step out of the box more. Regardless of where you are on that spectrum, we should all regulate our creative and critical forces. But how do we do that? Let's say, for example, that you want to practice writing a conflict and resolving that conflict in a way that is unexpected while still fitting the pattern. This is really hard to do. So in order to try, you have to relax the judgmental part of your brain. How do you do that? I suggest brainstorming. Sit down with your friends and talk about plots and come up with ideas for endings. Come up with a lot of bad ideas for endings until you accidentally come across a good idea for an ending. Let your friends come up with ideas that you hate and see if you can mutate those ideas into ideas that you don't hate. You might come across a good ending that doesn't answer the question that you initially asked. In that case, you can change the question to fit this new ending that you like more. Finding this pair of question and answer is a difficult thing to do. My first writing teacher, Caitlin Sweet, used to say that writing a novel is like solving a puzzle box while building it, and it took me a long time to understand how right she was. Please don't expect to get it right on the first try. Treat it as a challenge, as a heroic challenge even, because it is. And I'm not saying it to discourage you, on the contrary. I'm saying it so you'll feel better about yourself while failing all the way to the top, because sucking at something is the first step towards being sort of good at something. Beautiful, isn't it? Seriously, is it? How are you supposed to know if something that you find beautiful is going to be beautiful for other people? Well, you don't. That's what better readers are for. But what you do know is that when you write something beautiful, it's fun. I talk to a lot of writers who tell me that they don't enjoy writing, and I find that peculiar. When I ask them, usually what I come to is that the way they approach writing, the way they think about it, isn't fun. They aren't surprising themselves with the solutions they find. They don't feel like they're taking cracks at this super challenging puzzle. Instead, they create characters and then kind of push those characters through plot points. When you find a clever solution to a fighting scene or a witty dialogue, you will enjoy it guaranteed. On the other hand, that's just a beautiful bird. I'm sorry you can't see it. Wow. Wow. I've never seen anyone like it. I've never seen a bird like it, and it's wow. Video. On the other hand, I see a lot of beginner writers who prioritize beauty over clarity. And let's talk about prose for a second. I do think it's more important to write clear prose than beautiful prose, but you don't have to choose one. Let's finish this segment with an example. It's not a song, it is the name of a song by Andrew Jackson Jihad. And it goes a little something like this. The Michael Jordan of drunk driving played his final game tonight. Did you feel that? Something clicking into place? What kind of emotions arose in you while reading? Emotions are important. One could even claim that the whole purpose of writing is engendering emotions. One would be wrong, but they could still claim it. However, I do think that emotions are the thing that gives writing its meaning. Let me build up your interest with another question. Why do human beings love stories so much? In other words, how did human beings come out of the furnace of evolution with such a love for narratives? It's fun, sure, but eating calorie dense food is fun, and holding hands is fun, but both of these pretty clearly lead to you having more fertile offspring. It could be that stories is one of those phenomena like homosexuality and suicidality that are really difficult, though not impossible, to explain through an evolutionary lens. However, both of these affect less than half of the population while we all love stories. So why do human beings spend so much of their time reading and listening to stories? I came up with two answers. One is the learning hypothesis. Understanding other human beings and yourself is really conducive to survival in a tribe. A story that leaves you with a feeling of meaning has to do with you going along through someone's emotional experience and understanding them better. The learning hypothesis states that the reason that we enjoy stories so much in the same way that we enjoy calorie-dense food is because it makes us likelier to survive because we understand other people better. After you've seen a supervillain being betrayed and choose to take revenge against the entire world, you might be better equipped to understand a person who goes through a similar process in real life. A meaningful story takes you through the life of another person and helps you see things through their perspective. Do that enough times and you will become better at understanding other people. Citation needed, I guess, but this is what I believe. But it's not just about other people's perspectives. A good story teaches you how to be a human being. When you watch a movie about a young protagonist beating a space empire or an evil sorcerer, what you're really following is the emotional process the hero goes through. They're afraid, but they find inside themselves the courage to go on. They choose to trust their friends when it counts, believe in themselves, and show compassion to a beaten villain. The more of this behavior you watch, the more you feel like acting that way yourself, because a part of your brain sees these movies as instructions on how to win at life. This is why people hate movies where the protagonists lose. Even if the story is about Norse gods fighting aliens, they come there to learn about how to emotionally deal with the fight. That is, keep your spirits up and keep cracking jokes and come up with clever solutions. According to the learning hypothesis, stories are our way to learn how to deal with the world. Young people love stories about winning because they still think they can win, while old people, like myself, like stories about defeat, because we're looking for ways to deal with defeat. But then again, if you've already been defeated, what's the point of learning about it? This might be better explained by the validation hypothesis. The validation hypothesis claims that the reason that we love stories so much is not so much because they teach us anything, but because they show us ourselves from the outside. They give us a new perspective on the things that we've already been through. Let's say you've been horribly bullied at school and you still kind of blame yourself for it, for not dealing with the situation better. Then you go and read Worm, a book about a girl who's being horribly bullied at school, and you see that she deals with everything perfectly. And still it doesn't work for her. You realize that you blaming yourself had nothing to do with whether what you did was right or wrong, was good enough or not good enough. It's just an emotional response that people go through. But what about stuff that can't be explained by either of these hypotheses? What about super predictable action movies repeating the same plot again and again? What about portal fantasy with an overpowered MC who everyone falls in love with? What about revenge narratives that are nearly identical? Not sure. It probably has something to do with reassurance and escapism. For me, art that doesn't surprise you or teach you anything new, art that doesn't move you, is simply porn. I'm going to talk about porn one day, but today is definitely not that day. So for now, let's keep talking about stories that nourish the soul, stories that give you what you need and not what you want. One such story is called Naruto. Naruto is an orphan that grows up in a village where everyone is a ninja. The thing is, for reasons that are not his fault, Everybody in this village hates him. Naruto's response to this rejection is to choose to be the kindest that he can be to everyone he meets, including his enemies, because he knows how horrible loneliness feels, because nobody deserves to be alone. But he also knows that in order to change the world, you need to be strong. So he sets out on a journey to become stronger, and on that journey, he encounters some strong ninja. Because he is always kind, he makes a lot of friends. He even turns some of his enemies into friends, though usually after beating them up, which is a really important message. These friends make Naruto stronger, not just because they give him more knowledge, but also because they motivate him to train hard. Because he has friends that believe in him, he always does his best to protect these friends. Sasuke is another orphan in that very same village. Sasuke also wants to be strong, but he only cares about himself. Because he doesn't have anyone to protect and the people who do teach him don't really care about him, he doesn't become as strong as Naruto. In the end, Naruto and Sasuke fight, and their fighting symbolizes the fight between those different ideologies, these different life strategies. But it's more than that. Whoever wins the fight is the one that had the correct emotional response, the response that the author wants to teach you. I haven't actually watched the ending because the author kept coming up with new questions that I simply didn't care about, but I'm assuming that Naruto ends up winning. The author gives you a message. Both of these orphans had to deal with rejection, and one of them dealt with it better than the other. The meaning of the story is this: when people reject you, you should try and stay kind. You should keep trying to make new connections and be good to others, even if they weren't good to you. But why isn't it enough to just tell you this message? Because you need to feel it. Every time that you are there with Naruto as he offers his hand to a beaten opponent, you need to imagine the compassion that he feels. You feel in yourself what it would be like to be him. This is why it's really important to write credible emotional responses. If the reader doesn't believe the emotional response that you're describing, they're not going to receive the message of meaning. The emotional response needs to make sense. Meaning has in it an element of beauty. It needs to make sense in a way that you didn't see before. Let's once again use Naruto as an example for this. When you see Naruto being abandoned as a child, you feel your own emotional response to being abandoned, which is probably self-pity or resentment or anger. Naruto's response is different than yours. It's surprising, but it still makes sense. And because it makes sense, it makes it seem like it would be possible for you to learn how to react that way too. Because Naruto usually ends up winning, it makes you want to learn to react emotionally like he does. You could also learn how to react emotionally like Sasuke, and many people do every single day, but because Sasuke loses, you want to be less like him. This is why foils are important, which is something you intuitively know. Comparative storytelling is something that we do naturally. The third answer to when did you start writing is when I started talking about other people. Let me tell you a story. I was sitting with an animator friend last week and we talked about the price of pursuing our passion. He wondered if people who are not pursuing their passions are sad because they gave up on their dreams, or are they happier because they don't have to deal with the burden of uncertainty that comes with actually trying. Without thinking about it, we instantly started telling stories about people we know. He told me a story about Alice that gave up on her passion and is happy. I brought up a story about Bob who pursues his passion and is unhappy, and we naturally found the two complementary stories. After having these four different characters to compare, we tried to find the key differences and answer the main question: how do you know if you're the kind of person who should pursue their passion? This is basically what a theme is. The only thing separating these four anecdotes from becoming a real story is that each one of these characters exists separately. If we wrote a story making these people interact in a plot that would be engaging and beautiful, we'd basically have a story with the theme of pursuit of passion. When I analyze, I usually follow the learning hypothesis. Regardless of the author's intent, I assume that the story is meant to teach me something, and so I try to understand what that thing is. So when writing a story yourself, I would naturally advise you to write one that has meaning. But how do you choose what meaning to convey? And that's the beauty. You don't choose. You just write whatever emotional trajectories make sense to you, and the meaning will only be revealed to you once you are done. Most likely, after you let other people read it. Quoting the Tao Te Ching, we work with being, but non-being is what we use. That is, we let our subconscious minds lead. Recently, I was commissioned to do a developmental edit to a semi-autobiographical book about a girl falling in love with another girl while they are both attending a religious conservative boarding school, and the plot mostly revolves around how that love grows while the girls hide it from the authorities. Reading it, I felt that for the protagonist, the act of holding hands with another girl was more than fun, more than connecting to another human being. It was important because by acting on her desire, the protagonist claimed her identity as a human being. I told this to the author, and she said that's how she felt too when she was a teenager, even though she wouldn't know to tell me that herself. How is it possible that I got something from her book that I wouldn't be able to get from talking to her? How is it possible that reading my own books and talking to friends about them, I grew to understand things about myself that I did not consciously know? This is why I tell all of my friends to write stories. There is a facet of their being that just wouldn't be revealed to me any other way, and there's something so cool about learning something new about somebody you've known for decades. This is why I love writing groups. You get to see things that you wouldn't otherwise see. For instance, a friend of mine told me that as she was giving feedback on a Portal Fantasy novella, she said, not knowing why, that the story reminded her of a divorce. In the story, the protagonist ends up leaving the world that he loves and the people that he loves in order for everybody else to be happy. The moment she said this, she saw in the author's expression that she had been right. The author was going through a divorce, and he poured those emotions into the story. What does it mean to pour your emotions into the story? It means that as he came up with ideas for the story, his subconscious mind naturally brought up ideas about the same emotional states and emotional transitions that he was going through at the same time. My first novel is about people in a death camp in space, a very Jewish narrative, I know. Each one of the characters is thrown out into the vacuum with a spacesuit and 24 hours of oxygen on them, and each one of the characters deals with the knowledge of their upcoming death in a different way. Some try to be remembered, some try to do as much good as they can before they're gone, and the villainess, who is my favorite character, just kills people for their oxygen. Not only did I get a lot of interesting comments about my own psyche from the people who read it, but after I was done writing it, I felt like I was more at peace with the idea of dying. I felt like I had processed it to a degree. I don't need to tell you that I think writing is worth it. It lets you see yourself from the outside. It lets other people see you from the inside. It is a challenge worth succeeding at. More importantly, it is a challenge worth failing at. Even if you write something and never let anybody read it, it will have been worth it. First of all, because you will know yourself better, but more importantly, because every novel that you will ever read, every story, will be that much more meaningful to you because you will know what it took from the other person emotionally to create this thing that you enjoy so much. It is time to summarize. When you want to shoot, shoot. I talked about many different things in this video and told many different stories, and I would like to coalesce them all into one single takeaway. And I would like to do that with one last story. Miyamoto Musashi was a swordsman who lived in Japan between the years 1584 and 1645. And between the year that he was born and the year that he died, he killed 62 people in sword duels alone, and quite a few more on the battlefield. This was obviously a man who knew a thing or two about cutting a man to death. At the old age of 60, as he was dying of cancer, probably, he decided to crystallize his ideas in the form of a book, which he called the Book of Five Rings. That book is still praised by Japanese businessmen and politicians as the book about strategy, or at least that's what it says on the stub. I want to share with you a passage from this book. It's probably the most quoted one, and there's a reason it's relatively popular. It goes something like this. The primary thing when you take a sword in your hand is your intention to cut the enemy, whatever the means. Whenever you parry, hit, spring, strike, or touch the enemy's cutting sword, you must cut the enemy in the same movement. It is essential to attain this. If you think only of hitting, springing, striking, or touching the enemy, you will not be able to actually cut them. But what does this have to do with writing? Why am I even telling you this? Because I see so many writers who follow these long lists of rules, who anxiously check boxes instead of writing. I see these people who have this great vision that they aren't even thinking about how to communicate in a way that would actually be enjoyable to read. I would like you to remember what the purpose of writing is, what it is that you wish to attain. And what you wish to attain is to create within your reader an experience that is meaningful, beautiful, and engaging. Even though the end goal is creating an experience inside of another person who has tastes similar to yours, I don't think you can do that without digging into yourself and finding something that is meaningful and beautiful to you and communicating it in a way that would be interesting. That's why I think writing should be fun, hard, and emotionally cathartic, because solving and making puzzles is enjoyable, and if you're not having fun, you're probably not building a puzzle box. Similarly, if you don't feel emotions in you when you write, I don't think you can engender them in a reader, unless maybe if that reader is a child, and even in that case, I'm not sure. I think that if you want to make your reader go through a meaningful emotional experience, you have to go through one yourself. You remember that scene from Being John Malkovich where John Malkovich kind of scolds that puppeteer for not crying while the doll is supposed to cry? Something like that. How do we improve in that? By writing a lot and getting critique for that writing, which I'm going to talk about in the next videos, but also by reading. When you read, try to understand how the author created in you engagement, how they made you feel things. This is why I recommend reading outlying fiction, fiction that is unique and not necessarily popular, and analyzing that. If you decide, for instance, to try and read my favorite book, Worm, try to understand how it creates in you so much engagement that it becomes excessive, that it feels like you're too hooked. How is it that the emotional impacts are just so strong, but at the same time try to understand why the dialogue never quite feels natural, and why is it that even if you like some of the characters, you wouldn't actually want to sit down with them and have a coffee. Likewise, if you go and read A Practical Guide to Evil, which I think is the most fun series of books ever written, try to understand what it is that changes between the first book and the second book. Because in the first book, the dialogue is kind of cringe, and in the second, it's hilarious, and it keeps being hilarious all the way to the seventh. Can you pinpoint what it is that's changed? You don't need to be an analyst to realize that the characters in this book are some of the most likable ever. But can you understand why? Can you understand how they can be so much bigger than life while at the same time feeling like real people? And if you do understand, can you write one yourself? And if that seems like too big of a task for you, don't. Just write. Go out and fail beautifully. I know so many people who wanted to write and never did, not even a story. And if you write something, anything, you will have nothing but my respect, even if that thing is straight up cringe. And if you don't want to write stories, write a beautiful love letter, write an email, text a friend in a way that will move them. And if you don't feel like writing at all, speak. Speak your mind in a way that communicates something that is unique to you, something that is real to you from within your heart and soul. Acknowledge the power that words have and string them together in a way that will change somebody's life. That is something you can actually do today. In the words of Paulo Sergio Gomez that have been echoing in my cranium for the past 20 years, make a difference, have a motherfucking impact. This is what writing is. Huge thanks to my beautiful patrons, especially Lex, the Duck, and Zilch for giving me excellent comments on this essay and making it slightly more everything. You know already what are the three things. Until next time, speak, you hear?